The small town was quiet, with streets lined by old trees and houses that had stood for generations. Most people knew each other by name and news traveled fast, but this time the news was confusing everyone. There was a problem that no one could understand. It was about a property dispute that had been going on for months, and everyone was waiting for lawyers to explain what was really happening. The adults were talking in hushed voices, shaking their heads, and arguing quietly in corners of their homes. They seemed tired, frustrated, and more confused than ever. The problem had started when an old man, who had lived in the town for decades, passed away. He had left behind a will, but it was not written clearly. Parts of it were smudged, and some sentences didn't make sense. The lawyers tried their best, but every time they spoke, they used words that the normal townspeople could not understand. The words were long, the sentences complicated, and the meaning was lost in the language of law. Everyone was more confused after the lawyers spoke than before. The family members who were supposed to receive the property were frustrated. They sat in the lawyer's office, nodding politely, but in their minds, they were trying to decode the complicated sentences and figure out what it all meant. Each lawyer had a different opinion, and sometimes they even contradicted each other. One said the property belonged to one side, another said it belonged to another, and a third lawyer said it was too complicated to decide yet. The arguments went on, and no one left the room with a clear answer. In the middle of all this confusion lived an 8-year-old girl. She was small, with bright eyes that seemed to notice everything around her. While adults worried and argued, she watched quietly. She loved asking questions, but most adults dismissed her thoughts as childish. She didn't understand all the legal words either, but she had a way of noticing the things others overlooked. She paid attention to the little details, like which paper was smudged, who seemed worried, and what everyone said when they thought no one was listening. The girl often sat near the window of her small home, looking at the people walking on the street. She saw neighbors whispering about the property dispute, and she listened to adults talking late at night about what the lawyers had said. Sometimes she even pretended to read the letters and papers, though she could not read all the complicated words. She felt a mix of curiosity and concern. She wanted to know what was really happening, not just the confusing version the adults kept repeating. One afternoon, she went to visit her grandmother, who had been part of the discussions. The grandmother was sitting in her chair, frowning at a sheet of paper, mumbling words that made no sense. The girl leaned over and asked softly, "Grandma, what does this mean?" Her grandmother sighed and shook her head. "I don't really know, dear. The lawyers say so many things, and it all sounds so confusing. I just hope it works out the right way." The girl thought for a moment. She noticed that the grandmother kept pointing to certain words on the paper, circling them with her finger. She asked, "Why are these words circled?" "They are supposed to be important," the grandmother said, "but I cannot understand why. Every lawyer says something different." The girl nodded. She didn't fully understand the paper either, but she started to pay close attention to the words her grandmother circled. She also remembered what the adults said when they argued, the moments when they raised their voices, and the times they paused, unsure of what to do next. The next day, the girl walked down the street to meet a neighbor. The neighbor had a shop filled with books and papers. She liked to visit because she could see old documents and letters that no one else had time to look at. She asked the neighbor if she could see some of the papers related to the property dispute. The neighbor smiled and handed her a folder, saying, "Be careful with these. They are important." Sitting on a small bench outside, the girl flipped through the papers. She did not understand all the words, but she noticed patterns. Some words kept appearing, some names were written multiple times, and some sentences seemed incomplete. She marked the ones that seemed different or unusual. While adults were tangled in legal arguments, she was quietly organizing the information in a way that made sense to her. Days passed, and the girl continued her quiet observation. She listened when lawyers visited the homes, taking notes in her little notebook. She asked simple questions that made adults pause. "Why does this person get this?" Or, "Does this paper really say that?" Some laughed and ignored her, thinking she was just a curious child. Others looked uncomfortable, Realizing they could not answer so simply, the town grew more tense. Family members argued, neighbors whispered, and some people even started to lose hope that the truth would come out. Meetings were held, papers were shuffled, and everyone waited for the lawyers to clarify the situation. But every meeting ended with more confusion than before. Adults shook their heads and muttered to each other about how difficult the case was. Even the lawyers seemed frustrated. They had studied for years, spent long hours reviewing the documents, and yet, every time they tried to explain, it only made matters worse. Some admitted quietly to each other that the will and the property papers were written in a way that even they found puzzling. They didn't want to say it out loud in front of the family, so they kept using long words and technical phrases, hoping someone would understand. Meanwhile, the girl continued her quiet investigation. She noticed contradictions in what the lawyers said. One lawyer would say the property belonged to a certain person, and another lawyer would say it could not. Some parts of the papers were clear to her in a way they were not to the adults. She began drawing simple diagrams, connecting names to properties, and marking what she thought was important. She did not tell anyone what she was doing. She just worked quietly day after day. Her parents watched her, curious but unsure. "Why do you care so much?" they asked one evening. She looked up, her eyes serious. "Because someone has to understand it," she said. "Everyone else is confused." Her parents exchanged a glance and smiled softly. They did not fully understand, but they admired her determination. The girl had a way of looking at things that cut through confusion. While adults argued over complicated words, she focused on the facts, the relationships, and the little details no one noticed. Soon, the girl began asking neighbors simple questions. She wanted to know who had lived in the houses, what had happened when the old man passed away, and what people remembered about conversations long ago. Adults found themselves answering her honestly because her questions were so straightforward. She wrote everything down carefully, making her own notes, separate from the confusing legal papers. It was becoming clear, even to some adults, that the girl had a special way of seeing the situation. While the lawyers were busy trying to explain things in complicated ways, she was quietly understanding the truth. People started to notice, and some even whispered, "Maybe she can figure this out." Despite her young age, the girl felt a quiet sense of responsibility. She did not want to just know the truth for herself. She wanted the adults, the family, and the community to understand it too. She knew that clarity could bring peace, while confusion only caused arguments and frustration. As the days turned into weeks, the lawyer meetings continued, but no one left with real understanding. Papers were shuffled, words were explained and re-explained, and still the truth seemed hidden behind layers of complexity. The girl, however, had begun to see the connections that others could not. She quietly prepared herself for the moment when she might speak up, even though she was just 8 years old. She did not yet know how adults would react or if they would listen, but she had a simple belief. The truth could be explained in a way that everyone could understand. It did not need long words, arguments, or legal jargon. It only needed clear thinking and honesty, and she was determined to find it. This was the beginning. The town was confused, the adults were frustrated, and the lawyers could not clarify the situation. But one small girl, with sharp eyes and a curious mind, had started to see the truth. The quiet work she did, unnoticed by most, was setting the stage for something remarkable. She was about to show that even in the most complicated problems, simplicity and honesty could reveal the real story, and everyone was about to be surprised by what she would discover. The days grew longer, and the small town buzzed with quiet tension. Adults wandered from house to house, whispering in corners, trying to understand the latest update from the lawyers. Meetings were held in offices and living rooms, each one ending with more confusion than clarity. No one knew what to believe. Every time someone thought they had an answer, a lawyer would change it, contradict another, or introduce new words that made even the simplest points complicated. Family members argued in hushed tones. One side believed the property was theirs, the other insisted it belonged elsewhere. Friends and neighbors tried to stay neutral, but it was impossible. People grew frustrated, and the stress of uncertainty weighed heavily on everyone. Some even started avoiding each other, afraid of picking sides or saying the wrong thing. It felt as if the town itself had fallen into a cloud of confusion, thick and unyielding. In the middle of all this, the 8-year-old girl continued to observe quietly. She noticed things that adults could not see, small details that seemed meaningless but added up to something bigger. She listened when lawyers spoke, when family members argued, and when neighbors whispered their guesses. She did not understand the complicated words, but she understood the patterns. She understood who really cared, who was hiding something, and who was just repeating what they had heard. One afternoon, she followed a lawyer as he walked down the street after a long meeting. She did not want to be noticed, so she stayed a few steps behind, pretending to look at flowers and the cracks in the sidewalk. She overheard him talking on the phone, muttering about contradictions in the papers and unclear sentences. The lawyer sounded tired and frustrated. The girl's eyes widened. Even the experts were confused. That made her realize something important. Maybe she could see the truth in a way the adults could not. Back at home, she spread out the papers she had been collecting. She stacked them carefully, sorting them into groups. Some were smudged, some had notes scribbled in the margins, and some were old letters that mentioned names, dates, and events. She traced lines with her finger, connecting names to properties, people to letters, and events to decisions. It felt like a puzzle, and slowly, piece by piece, she began to see a pattern that no one else seemed to notice. She asked simple questions whenever she could. At the dinner table, she said, "Why did Uncle say that part belongs to Aunt, but the lawyer said it doesn't?" Her parents looked at each other, unsure how to answer. They were used to long, complicated explanations that did not make sense. Finally, her father shrugged. "I think no one really knows," he admitted. The girl nodded. That was all she needed to hear. It confirmed her observation. The adults were lost in words and papers, and the lawyers could not simplify it. She began to feel a quiet determination. She would not give up. If she could organize the information clearly, perhaps she could understand the truth, and maybe others could too. She began visiting neighbors more often, asking gently about events she had read in letters. She asked them to describe what happened when the old man passed away, who came to the house, and who spoke about the property. She wrote everything down using short sentences and simple words. The neighbors, surprised at her attention and honesty, told her more than they would have told an adult. They liked how straightforward her questions were, without judgment or confusion. Meanwhile, the lawyers continued to hold meetings, unaware of the little girl gathering her own information. During one long discussion, the lawyers argued over the interpretation of one sentence in the will. "It clearly states the property goes to the eldest cousin," one said. "No, it says nothing about that," another argued. "It's too vague. We cannot decide without more information." Family members sat silently, hoping for a clear explanation. But the words became tangled, and the sentence that was supposed to settle the dispute only made it worse. Some people left the room shaking their heads, muttering about the complexity of legal language. The girl, sitting quietly in the corner of the office with her notebook hidden under her coat, watched and wrote. She did not need the legal words to understand the situation. She only needed facts, observations, and connections. She noticed contradictions like small clues no adult seemed to pay attention to. One letter mentioned a property given to a cousin, but another letter from the same time contradicted it. Some names were written incorrectly, some dates didn't match, and some promises were never mentioned in the will at all. She made notes carefully, sometimes drawing arrows and circles, showing the connections and contradictions in a way that anyone could follow. Even her parents began to notice her dedication. "Why do you spend so much time on this?" her mother asked one evening. "It's too complicated for you." The girl looked up, calm and serious. "Because if someone can understand it, it should be me. Adults are lost. Lawyers are lost. I just want to know the truth." Her parents were amazed by her focus. They did not fully understand the legal problem, but they understood her determination. They decided not to stop her, realizing that her fresh eyes might see something they could not. Days turned into weeks. The town became more tense. People whispered about rumors, made guesses, and argued over what the lawyers said. Some were exhausted and frustrated, while others became suspicious of each other. The property dispute had changed the peaceful rhythm of the town. But amidst all the tension, the girl quietly organized her notes. She read old letters, cross-checked details, and drew diagrams that connected every person to every property and every event she could find. She began to notice patterns that were invisible to the adults. The lawyers focused on technical words, contracts, and vague statements. The family members focused on emotions and memories. But the girl focused on facts. She saw that some statements in the will contradicted earlier conversations. She noticed that certain people were assumed to be the rightful owners, but letters suggested otherwise. She connected the dots, and slowly, a clearer picture emerged. At night, she often lay awake thinking. She imagined herself standing in front of the adults, explaining the situation in a way everyone could understand. She imagined the lawyers stopping mid-sentence, surprised at her clarity. She imagined family members smiling with relief, finally understanding the truth. She knew she was small, but she also knew that sometimes, small eyes see what big eyes miss. One morning, as she walked past the offices where the lawyers worked, she overheard them talking about a new complication. "We might need another meeting," one said. "This is even more tangled than we thought." The girl smiled quietly to herself. She had been untangling it in her notebook for weeks. She felt ready. Soon she would speak up. The town was lost in confusion, but she had started to see the way forward. Her little notebook, filled with simple words, arrows, and diagrams, had become her map through the chaos. While adults argued, whispered, and stressed, she had quietly gathered the pieces of the puzzle. She had discovered contradictions, patterns, and overlooked facts. She had seen the truth that everyone else missed, not because she understood legal words, but because she understood the people, the events, and the relationships. The town continued its anxious rhythm, with meetings, arguments, and whispers. The lawyers still could not clarify anything. Adults were still frustrated, and family members still worried. But the 8-year-old girl, small and unassuming, had begun to build a bridge over the confusion. She was collecting the truth in her own way, preparing for the moment when the adults would have no choice but to listen. And when that moment came, everyone would be surprised by what a little girl could see. The small town carried on with its usual rhythm, though a quiet tension hung in the air. Adults continued to meet, discuss, and argue, trying to untangle the confusing property dispute. The lawyers, despite their years of experience, still seemed unable to explain the matter clearly. Every meeting ended with more questions than answers. People began to lose faith in the process. Rumors spread quickly, and neighbors whispered guesses about who would eventually get what. The uncertainty weighed heavily on everyone, but the 8-year-old girl watched silently, determined to find the truth for herself. She had been gathering information for weeks now. Her little notebook was becoming a treasure trove of observations, facts, and small notes that connected events and people in ways no one else noticed. While adults debated in long, confusing sentences, she had mapped the situation in a way that made sense. She drew lines from names to letters, circled contradictions, and marked the important points. Each day she added something new. Sometimes she would sit for hours, staring at the papers, thinking about what each detail meant. One day, she visited an elderly neighbor who had known the family for years. The neighbor lived alone in a small house with windows filled with plants. She was happy to see the girl and welcomed her inside. The girl asked gently, "Can you tell me what happened when the old man passed away? Who was in the house? What did they say?" The neighbor paused, thinking carefully. She smiled at the girl's patience and curiosity. "I can tell you," she said softly. She spoke slowly, recounting the events of that day. The girl listened carefully, asking small clarifying questions when something was unclear. She wrote everything down neatly, using short words and simple sentences. After leaving the neighbor, the girl walked to another house, asking similar questions. Each person she spoke to gave slightly different accounts. One mentioned a conversation in the kitchen, Another spoke of a letter that had been read aloud. She noticed that even small differences could be important. Some details contradicted others. She carefully wrote these contradictions in her notebook, connecting them with arrows and notes. Slowly, the larger picture began to take shape. Back at home, she laid out all her notes and papers on the floor. She looked at each page carefully, comparing names, dates, and events. The contradictions started to form patterns. She noticed that some statements the lawyers were arguing over had already been contradicted by earlier letters and conversations. Some promises were never written down properly. Some property names were used incorrectly. Each observation made the story clearer in her mind. Even though adults were still struggling to understand IT.AT school, she would sometimes quietly ask friends about their family's history with the town or the properties. Children often told her small details that adults overlooked. They spoke freely without realizing the significance. The girl listened intently and added these details to her growing map of the dispute. Each piece of information, no matter how small, brought her closer to understanding the truth. Meanwhile, adults continued to argue over the lawyer's explanations. In one heated meeting, the lawyers debated a single sentence for almost an hour. "It says the property goes to the eldest cousin," one said. "No, it does not. The words are unclear," another countered. The family members looked lost, and some even walked out, shaking their heads in frustration. The lawyer's words were precise but confusing, and the adults could not follow the complicated reasoning. The girl sat quietly outside the meeting room with her notebook. She did not need long words or legal phrases. She only needed facts and connections. She compared what the lawyers said with the letters, with the conversations she had heard, and with the observations she had made. Slowly, she noticed errors in the lawyer's reasoning, contradictions they had not seen, and details they had ignored. Each realization was like a small light in the darkness of confusion. Her parents began to notice the effort she was putting into understanding the situation. One evening, her father asked, "Do you really think you can understand this better than the lawyers?" She looked up with calm eyes. "I don't need to be a lawyer. I just need to see what is true. Adults are missing some facts. Lawyers are missing some facts. I can put it all together." Her parents were quiet, impressed by her determination. They realized that she was seeing the problem in a way no one else could. They began to encourage her gently, asking if she needed help gathering information or clarifying her notes. She smiled and said she could do it alone, but appreciated their support. The girl continued her observations. She noticed the way people reacted when certain names were mentioned. Some seemed nervous, others hesitant, and some spoke too quickly. She realized that these reactions were clues. They revealed emotions, intentions, and hidden details that were not written anywhere. She marked these reactions in her notebook, connecting them with events and letters. One day, she decided to visit the office where the lawyers worked. She could not enter without permission, but she waited outside, observing who came and went, what papers were being carried, and which conversations were taking place through open windows. She noticed that some documents never left certain offices and that some people seemed more concerned with appearances than truth. She carefully made notes, drawing diagrams of the flow of information. Neighbors began to notice her quiet diligence. Some smiled, some whispered, "That little girl might see something the adults cannot." They admired her curiosity, patience, and intelligence. She did not brag or call attention to herself. She simply worked quietly, connecting dots, and understanding the situation in ways that adults had overlooked. As the dispute continued, the town's tension grew. Adults argued in hushed tones, families whispered in corners, and meetings with lawyers became more frequent and confusing. Despite all the noise and arguments, the girl remained focused. She had a plan. She would gather all the information, connect the dots, and see the real truth. She knew it would not be easy. Adults might not listen, lawyers might dismiss her, but she felt a quiet confidence that she was on the right path. She continued to organize her notes, grouping letters, conversations, and observations. She made diagrams that showed who said what when it happened and how it connected to other events. Contradictions were circled, Missing details were marked, and patterns became clear. Slowly, she began to see a map of the truth hidden beneath the confusion. One evening, she shared a small piece of her findings with her parents. "Look at this," she said. "See how this letter contradicts the lawyer's statement? And this conversation supports it? If we put it together like this, it makes sense." Her parents studied her notes carefully, amazed at the clarity she had created. "You've noticed things we never saw," her mother said softly. "This is remarkable." The girl smiled quietly. She knew she was getting closer. She felt that soon the truth would be revealed. It would not come from the lawyers, who were trapped in complicated words, nor from the adults, who were lost in frustration. It would come from her using simple observation, careful attention, and clear thinking. The town continued its anxious rhythm, with meetings, arguments, and whispered guesses. Lawyers continued to debate, adults continued to worry, and family members continued to hope for clarity. But the girl had begun to see the truth, piece by piece, in a way no one else could. Her little notebook, filled with diagrams, notes, and observations, had become a map through the chaos. She knew the moment to speak was coming. She felt it quietly in her heart. The adults were lost, the lawyers were lost, but she was ready. She would explain the truth in simple words, in a way that everyone could understand. And when she did, the town, the lawyers, and the families would be surprised by what a little girl had discovered through patience, observation, and honesty. The town had grown tense with every passing day. Meetings with lawyers continued, family members whispered to each other, and neighbors speculated quietly on every detail they overheard. Yet despite all the chaos and confusion, the 8-year-old girl sat quietly in her corner, her notebook in hand, ready. Weeks of observation, note-taking, and connecting details had brought her to this moment. She had seen patterns that adults had missed, contradictions the lawyers could not resolve, and simple truths hidden beneath complicated words. The girl had practiced quietly for days, thinking about how to explain the truth clearly. She imagined herself standing in the room full of adults, speaking slowly and simply, pointing to diagrams in her notebook. She imagined the surprise on their faces when they realized that the truth was not as complicated as the lawyers had made it. She had no fear of speaking. She only wanted to help everyone understand what was really happening. One morning, the family called for a meeting at the lawyer's office. They were tired of endless confusion and wanted some final answers. Lawyers prepared for the meeting, expecting another long, confusing discussion filled with legal jargon and contradicting statements. What they did not expect was the small girl quietly standing at the edge of the room, her notebook clutched in her hands. The lawyers noticed her and exchanged glances. "She's just a child," one said quietly. "She won't understand anything." The girl stepped forward calmly. "I think I understand," she said in a clear voice. The room fell silent. Adults turned to look, some smiling kindly at her, some skeptical. The lawyers exchanged uncertain looks. The girl opened her notebook and placed it on the table. She pointed to her diagrams, tracing arrows from letters to people, from names to properties, and from conversations to events. She spoke slowly, using simple words that everyone could understand. "This property was mentioned in this letter," she said. "But this other letter says it belongs somewhere else. This person was promised part of it, but they were never in the will. If we look at all the letters and conversations together, we can see who the property really belongs to." The room was quiet. Adults leaned closer, trying to follow her explanation. The lawyers frowned, uncertain how to respond. They were used to long, complicated arguments and technical language, not simple diagrams and clear sentences from a child. Yet as they listened, they began to see the patterns she pointed out. They noticed the contradictions, the missing details, and the facts that had been overlooked. She continued, pointing to each part of her notebook. "This letter says one thing, this conversation says another. If we combine everything we know, this is what really happened. No one was trying to cheat anyone. The confusion is because the papers were unclear. But if we follow the facts carefully, it all makes sense." Family members gasped quietly. Some nodded slowly, realizing that she was correct. The lawyers, who had spent hours debating the same points, were stunned. The truth had been here all along, in simple details that everyone else had ignored. One lawyer finally said, "She's right. I see it now. The facts do match when you put them together like this." The girl smiled softly, not proud but relieved. She had done what she set out to do: clarify the confusion and reveal the truth in a way everyone could understand. She did not need complicated words or technical knowledge. She only needed observation, careful thinking, and honesty. The adults began to discuss the details she pointed out. The family members spoke quietly, confirming memories and checking letters. Neighbors nodded, recalling conversations they had witnessed. Slowly, the lawyers began to guide the discussion, using her diagrams to confirm the facts. The room that had been filled with confusion and frustration now felt lighter, as if a fog had lifted. One lawyer admitted quietly, "I have been looking at this for weeks and could not see it. She has made it clear in a way I never could." The adults nodded, some smiling, some shaking their heads in amazement. It was hard to believe that an 8-year-old had clarified what trained professionals could not. The girl continued to explain, moving carefully from one contradiction to another. She traced the connections between letters, conversations, and promises. Each time, the adults grew more impressed by her clarity and accuracy. She did not argue or accuse anyone. She only showed the facts, pointed out contradictions, and connected the dots. By the end of the meeting, the truth was clear. The property dispute, which had caused weeks of tension, had been resolved through her observations. The lawyers confirmed her conclusions and documented the findings officially. Family members smiled, relieved that the confusion was over. Neighbors who had been following the situation quietly nodded, impressed by the girl's insight. The adults were humbled. They realized that sometimes experience and education were not enough. Sometimes, seeing with fresh eyes, listening carefully, and thinking honestly could reveal truths that others missed. The girl had done exactly that. She had not needed legal training or authority. She had simply observed carefully, asked questions, and connected the facts. The girl's parents hugged her quietly after the meeting. "You were amazing," her mother whispered. "We never could have done this without you." She smiled softly. "I just wanted to understand," she said, "and I wanted everyone to see the truth." The lawyers, still slightly surprised, admitted that they had learned something important. They realized that clarity could come from simplicity, and that listening carefully was sometimes more valuable than speaking in long, complicated sentences. They made a note to remember this lesson in their future work. The town felt lighter after the meeting. The tension that had been weighing on everyone lifted. People talked again, laughed again, and the property dispute became a story of amazement rather than frustration. The girl returned home quietly, her notebook under her arm, content that she had helped everyone see the truth. Even days later, adults in the town would remember the moment a small girl had clarified what lawyers could not. They spoke of her intelligence, patience, and honesty. They marveled at her ability to see what others had missed and to explain it clearly. Her quiet determination had turned confusion into understanding, frustration into relief, and doubt into certainty. The girl returned to her usual life, still curious, still observant, but with a new quiet confidence. She had learned that even in a world filled with complex problems, simple observation, honesty, and careful thinking could make a difference. She had seen that clarity could come from the most unexpected places, and that truth, once revealed, could bring peace to a community that had been lost in confusion. After the meeting where the 8-year-old girl had clarified the confusing property dispute, the town slowly began to return to its normal rhythm. The tension that had hung over the streets, the whispers in homes, and the endless debates in offices began to fade. People smiled more often, neighbors spoke freely again, and the family involved in the dispute finally felt a sense of relief that had been missing for weeks. The girl continued her days as usual, going to school, playing in the yard, and helping her parents at home. Yet, there was a quiet sense of accomplishment in her heart. She knew that her careful observation, her patience, and her honest approach had made a real difference. Adults often spoke of the day she had explained everything, shaking their heads in amazement at how clearly she had understood what so many others could not. She had shown that sometimes simplicity and honesty could reveal what complicated arguments and technical knowledge could not. The family whose property had been disputed expressed their gratitude in many ways. They invited her parents for tea and quietly shared their thanks. The girl herself received smiles and small gifts from neighbors who admired her insight. No one treated her as a hero in a boastful way. Instead, they respected her quietly, appreciating the wisdom that could come from someone so young. She accepted their appreciation with a gentle smile, not letting it change her, for she had never done it for recognition. She had done it to understand the truth. Even the lawyers who had been so puzzled by the documents admitted their admiration. They spoke to each other about the lessons they had learned. One of them said, "We spent weeks trying to untangle this, and she showed us in one afternoon what we could not see. It reminds me that clarity can come from the most unexpected places." Another added, "It's a lesson we should remember for all future cases. Observation, honesty, and careful thinking are sometimes more powerful than knowledge alone." They recorded her insights in their files, noting how her diagrams and simple explanations had clarified what was unclear. The girl's parents quietly observed her growing confidence. They noticed that she seemed more self-assured, more willing to speak up when she believed something important. They did not push her, knowing she had discovered a strength within herself. She had learned that no matter the size of a person or the complexity of a problem, careful thinking, honest observation, and persistence could bring clarity. It was a lesson she would carry for the rest of her life. In the days that followed, people in the town began to talk about the value of listening. Adults realized that sometimes the youngest voices could see what others could not. They began to pay closer attention to children's observations, to notice small details, and to respect the honesty that often comes from those unburdened by assumptions and pride. The girl's quiet work had sparked a subtle change in the way the community thought about perspective and understanding. The family whose property had been clarified took steps to ensure everything was settled fairly. Letters were corrected, agreements were signed, and all parties left with a sense of resolution. They spoke kindly of the girl, explaining to others how her insight had solved weeks of confusion. Even neighbors who had only observed from a distance admired her focus and her dedication. They marveled at how a small child had cut through the complexity that had baffled adults and professionals alike. The girl continued to write in her notebook, not about disputes or problems this time, but about observations from daily life, simple lessons, and the small wonders she noticed. She drew diagrams of the way clouds moved in the sky, the way flowers grew in her garden, and the patterns she saw in the behavior of animals and people around her. Her notebook became a collection of thoughtful observations, a tool for understanding the world in ways that words alone could not describe. Teachers at school began to notice subtle changes in how she approached problems. She was patient, careful, and curious. She asked questions that encouraged classmates to think carefully. She noticed details others missed and gently guided her friends to consider possibilities they had overlooked. Her experience with the property dispute had taught her that clear thinking and observation could make complex things understandable, and she applied that lesson quietly without fanfare. Neighbors continued to talk about the story. They mentioned the way she had stood calmly in the meeting room, pointing to diagrams and explaining the facts with simple words. Adults shared the story with friends and family, marveling that someone so young had achieved what they had struggled to do. The girl's story became a quiet legend in the town, a reminder that clarity and honesty could shine through even the most tangled problems. Despite the recognition she received, the girl remained humble. She did not seek praise or attention. She was content knowing that she had helped her family, neighbors, and even the lawyers understand the truth. She knew that understanding and honesty were more important than accolades. Her joy came from seeing the relief in people's faces, from witnessing the confusion lift and clarity take its place. The town itself seemed lighter after the dispute was resolved. Streets that had been quiet with tension now rang with laughter and conversation. Meetings became more productive, neighbors helped each other freely, and families approached problems with a renewed sense of patience and observation. The girl's actions had shown everyone that understanding could come from paying close attention, from listening carefully, and from thinking clearly. Over time, the girl continued to grow in wisdom and observation. She encountered new problems and challenges, and each time, she applied the lessons she had learned. She approached complex situations calmly, listened carefully to all sides, and sought the truth in simple, honest ways. Her early experience with the property dispute had given her a skill that would serve her throughout life. The adults in the town often reflected on what had happened. They realized that they had been so caught up in technical details and legal jargon that they had lost sight of the obvious. The little girl had reminded them that truth could often be found in simple observations, honesty, and patience. They shared this lesson with others, ensuring that her example would continue to influence the community for years to come. In the end, the girl returned to her normal life, but the impact of her insight remained. She had shown that even in the midst of confusion and complexity, clarity was possible. She had demonstrated that courage, honesty, and careful thinking could solve problems that seemed impossible. The family had their property clarified, the lawyers had learned a valuable lesson, and the town had rediscovered the power of paying attention, listening carefully, and valuing the perspectives of everyone, even the youngest among them. The story of the girl who clarified what lawyers could not became a quiet reminder to all who heard it. It reminded people that no problem was too complex for clear thinking and observation. It showed that honesty and patience could reveal the truth. And it left the town with a sense of wonder and respect for the insight and wisdom that could come from the most unexpected place. The mind and heart of an 8-year-old girl who had simply wanted to understand.